second way the problem of evil can be formulated is through the probabilistic argument, or in other words, the likelihood that God does or does not exist in respect to the amount of evil in the world. Now, I think this second argument has a lot more weight to it than the first one does, the logical formulation of the argument, simply because the probabilistic argument has a much better and more reasonable conclusion, that being it is probable that God does not exist. However, there are still several factors that need to be considered that reduce the harshness of this formulation, and I will give 3 in this video. First and foremost, the problem of evil is relative to the amount of evidence for God's existence. In other words, the problem of evil does not occur in the evidential vacuum. When discussing probabilities and the likelihoods or percentages of a hypothesis, let's call hypothesis X, context is very, very important. For example, suppose that in the state of Iowa there is typically a 90% chance that it will rain in the month of August. However, suppose further, for the sake of argument, that in the nation of the United States there is a drought that's raging through the plains states. So all of a sudden, if we don't take into account the larger context, our percentage will be incorrect. The point being that probabilities are relative to all the information that we have. If all the information one examines in the world is the evil in the world, it makes a load of sense that they conclude that God does not exist. However, this is not how probabilities work, and in relation to the God hypothesis, evidence for the existence of God should be added to the equation. Thus, when the probability of God's existence is examined with respect to the evidence for his existence, the probability is not as one-sided. Moreover, it is not necessarily irrational to believe a statement that is improbable as long as one knows them to be true. For example, relative to biology, one's existence is astronomically improbable, yet you are in your full epistemic rights to believe it. Second, when asserting that God's existence is improbable in light of the existence of evil, we need to consider our position. We are not in good position to assess confidently the probability that God has no justifiable reason for permitting evil. As finite human beings, limited in our mental capacity, insight, and bound by our specific time and space, we are left staring at one side of a gigantic building while being oblivious to the other sides. Thus, evils that appear pointless or unnecessary to us may justly be permitted within God's transcendent and sovereign providence. Let us not make the mistake of thinking we have in mind every last detail of the outworkings of nature when we say the world could have been better, the world could have been X, the world could have been Y. Only an omniscient mind could grasp the complexities of directing a world of free creatures towards his providential goal. Third, and specific to Christian theism, Christian theology entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of evil and a benevolent, omniscient, loving God. When examining the probability of the existence of God in light of evil, Christian theism is much easier to defend than some skeletal theism. It will come as no surprise to those who have studied Christian theology that Christian theology never denies the existence of evil. It does not deny it, it does not reward passages to get around it, it simply accepts it. As a side note, the answer to the problem of evil via doctrine is one of the many reasons why I believe Christianity is more likely to be true than other religions. Let's examine 4 doctrines that explain the existence of evil. First, the chief purpose of life on this world is not happiness, but the knowledge of God. A popular view of God is that his ultimate purpose is to make us happy and treat us like his pets. However, on the Christian view, this is false. We are not God's pets, and our happiness is secondary to coming to the full knowledge and appreciation of God's heart and character. In respect to this insight, suffering and evil produces a deeper dependency and trust in God, although this is dependent on how we react to the suffering. And thus, evil may very well be a way God uses to draw people into his kingdom and let them grow deeper. Interestingly, it is countries that experience extreme persecutions, for example China, El Salvador, Ethiopia, and in the historical past Japan and the continent of Europe, that experience the greatest growth in Christian population. Patrick Johnson's Operation World and the U.S. Center for World Missions has both released swaying data on this very point. See the description for that. Second, Christian doctrine teaches that mankind is in open rebellion against God and his purpose. Christians are thus not surprised at moral evil in the world, but rather expect it. This is called human depravity, and within the Bible there are several passages, example Romans 1:24, verses 26 and 28, that indicate that God allows human depravity to run its course, increasing the moral responsibility and necessity of God's forgiveness and moral cleansing through Jesus Christ. As a side note, I remember listening to a popular YouTube atheist, Pat Condell, a while ago stating that Christianity offers something he doesn't need, being forgiven of sin. Ignoring that overcharged word, sin, I find it fascinating that he would deny the existence and capacity of evil in each human being. In my opinion, if we are to look for a Christian doctrine that has the most quantifiable and verifiable evidence for its plausibility, then I would suggest that you couldn't find a more evidence-based approach or doctrine than the reality of evil and sin in humanity. After all, that's the very question we are trying to answer right now, isn't it? Why is there so much evil in the world? If Pat Condell is so vehemently sure that humanity does not need saving and forgiveness, then I would ask him, from whence, then, is evil? Christianity has the answer. I wonder if his worldview does. Third, God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but also in the hereafter. Suffering and evil, then, in comparison to the eternal happiness and joy that we may experience, evil becomes a little easier to swallow. The Apostle Paul is an excellent example of this very point, when in 2 Corinthians 6:4-5 he writes that, "For this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison." End quote. Moreover, Christianity's doctrine of life after death does more for justice than the atheistic worldview, in my opinion. Instead of simply dying after a life full of suffering and pointless happenstance, with no final comeuppance, Christianity states that every evil that you suffer will be judged accordingly. Fourth and finally, the knowledge of God himself is an immeasurable good. To know God, the locus of infinite goodness and love, is an incomparable good that adds existential and logical fulfillment to human existence. The peace of mind, the assurance of heart, and the emotional strength belief in God adds is without comparison, in my point of view. So when we examine the probability of God's existence with the existence of evil, we need to be aware of the full scope of variables, namely 1. The evidence of God's existence. The evidence is for God's existence. 2. The limits of our human reasoning and position. 3. The answers that Christian doctrine provides in regard to the existence of evil. If you remember from my first video that I stated that it is not simply the theist that needs to give an answer to the problem of evil, but it is every worldview. I believe that Christianity has the best answer to the existence of evil in the world, and that evil strengthens the probability that God exists. Christianity has the answers. I'm curious to the coherence of the other answers out there.